Hello, BlizzCon. So it's been an awesome weekend so far. We've talked a lot about World of Warcraft. We have more to say, most of it looking forward to what's coming next. But for the next 45 minutes, we're going to look backwards. We're going to look at the origins of World of Warcraft and tell the story of how we have brought the 2006 experience back here and been able to share it all with you today. That's a game that touched all of our hearts. It's a game that really is the reason why I'm standing here today. It's a game that is the reason, so some could argue that BlizzCon exists at all. Back in 2005, it was World of Warcraft that forged these powerful ties between people who'd spent long nights running dungeons together, running flags in Warsong Gulch, who wanted to get in a car, get in a plane, cross the country, and come out here to put faces to names and to voices and actually meet the people that they felt like they already knew, thanks to this world that we had created. And it is an incredible honor to be up here and to be able to speak to the story of how we were able to bring it back. And a lot of that story is actually a technical one. It's about archaeology, it's about restoration. And allow me to introduce, to tell the first part of the story, senior software engineer Omar Gonzalez, who will tell you about the origins of WoW Classic.
Greetings, BlizzCon. My name is Omar Gonzalez, and I'm a senior software engineer on World of Warcraft. I want to take a minute, speaking of history, to talk about a little bit of my own. I first started on World of Warcraft in 2003, when it was first being forged. It means that I was there before Onyxia took her first deep breath, before Ragnaros was awoken too soon, before there was any kind of conflict in Tyrnmail and South Shore, before we had even added gnomes to the game. I was there, and I've been working on World of Warcraft ever since. And now it's my great honor to be able to take that version, the memories that we had, back to life to all of us who remember them fondly, and hopefully to a whole new generation. Now, next up, I'm going to be talking about some of the major components of what goes into the making of a game like World of Warcraft. One of the biggest pieces of data is our database data. And what this is are things like the number of hit points a creature has, the amount of stamina on an item, each spawn point in the world. Millions of points of data are stored in tables inside of these databases. Another key component that we work with are art assets. This is the color of Night Elves shadow melding in Ashenvale. It's the sounds that play when Pyroblast nukes its target. It's the motion of an orc as she swings her axe furiously. The artwork of the WoW, everything that you see and hear is our art assets. The third major component here is the source code. This is a bit of the glue that binds all of this together. It's the instructions that we give to our computers to let them know what to display on the screens and what to play on the speakers. And for our servers, how to interconnect millions of players all around the world. Now, there's actually many more components and pieces that go into game development, but these are the big three that we're going to cover in this presentation. So looking a little bit more into source code. We had to start to get a handle of what we had to work with. And for source code, we kept track of everything in a repository that keeps track of every change that's ever been made. So here it was simply a matter of going to that repository and asking, what is the first change you know about? How far back does your history go? And it turns out this repository has been tracking changes since 1997. Now, before you go to jumping to any conclusions, this doesn't necessarily mean that World of Warcraft itself has been in development that long, only that it contains some shared and generic bits of code that started the Warcraft lineage. Now, of course, no source code repository would be complete without bugs. We happened to also find the very first bug fix in our repository shortly thereafter. few people are ahead of me. The joke here is that this little bit of a function claimed it was going to do one thing, but literally did the exact opposite. Very first bug fix in Warcraft's history. Given that we have been tracking every change since 1997, we've had a high degree of confidence in our ability to restore this major component from the original version of World of Warcraft. Next up, I want to talk about how we worked with our database data. Now, to shed a little bit of light, early on, we only had really a simplistic model. There were two versions of the game. There was the version that was live and available to the public, and the next patch that we were working on. Once we were ready to release that patch, we would push it to the live services and make it available to everyone. Now, we would immediately then turn around and start working on the next patch, but we were doing it directly over the previous data. This had the unfortunate side effect of some amount of data loss in some of these earlier patches. We also encountered other problems here in that the team could only ever work on one patch at a time. This was quickly rectified, and we're now able to work on multiple patch schemas at a time. So when going back and looking at our database data, we took our clock, we cracked open this database and said, how far back do you still have data for? Fortunately, we still had patch 112 and slightly before. So this gave us sort of a medium level of confidence in our ability to restore original database data. Next up, I want to talk about art assets. There are many types of art assets. Some of the most familiar are what we call 3D models. And these are comprised of vertices, which are simply points in three-dimensional space, and indices that tell us how to connect these. Also, hopefully familiar, are textures. These are paintings and colors that are drawn on a two-dimensional canvas. We can take these various art assets, and once we start combining them, we're able to see a few familiar faces. Now, with art assets, we store those on some network storage that we have. And so when we went digging, we unfortunately found that we only had a few of the more recent art assets from the more recent expansions. But this project was very important to us, and we went all the way to our data archivists and asked, do you have any old backups of these old network drives? We need them. We desperately want to go back to the original data. Now, this data was actually off-site, and we weren't sure what we were going to find until some of the old backups were restored from very old tape drives. We did receive a backup from 2008, and we thought, well, the date's good, but not exactly what we're looking for. We dug into it a little bit more, and fortunately, we found on that backup a folder labeled Final 112 Data. Yeah, that's right. We found a backup on our backup of a backup. So, now that we have 112 versions of these three major components, our source code, our database data, and our art assets, we're ready to attempt to reconstruct 112 with these pieces. We shoved them all in a blender, and to our amazing delight, we had a version of 112 that we can launch and run internally. We were able to log in. We can create characters. Could level up and do all the things that we remembered. This was an amazing milestone for us. But we then needed to take a step back and think about what this version really meant. It's important to understand that our services, that this version of the game was engineered for a much older version of the internet. This version didn't understand how to run in our modern Blizzard cloud. We also realized that our game servers don't operate in a vacuum. They're an integral and important piece of a larger Battle.net Blizzard network framework, which includes things like account management and authentication. This version was also unable to work in our content delivery pipeline, so there was no way we could put this version on our Battle.net desktop app. Again, without access to authentication, there were no login servers it could talk to. There was no way this version could talk to our customer support systems. You couldn't enter GM tickets. But really, most harsh of all was that every bug, every problem, every exploit would instantly come screaming back. And not only that, they would already be known to some number of malicious people out there. Clearly, this version, as it stood, as it was, didn't really reflect the highest levels of Blizzard quality that we come to expect. But we weren't quite ready to give up. We took a long, hard look at what we had built so far, and we thought a lot of what we don't like about this version is in the source code. It still had a lot that we really loved. We loved the database data, and we loved the art. So we gave ourselves a little bit of a thought experiment. What if we brought up our modern database data, our modern high-resolution art, and modern source code, threw away what we don't like about this version, strip out the more modern components, and simply layered what we liked about this old version on top of what we needed in our modern tech stack? I remember standing around a room where we all looked at each other, and no one was quite sure whether this was a good idea or not. Was this viable? Would this work? And the reason for that has to do with how these pieces sort of fit and integrate with each other. That in these seams and these interconnects, those have also changed and evolved and improved over time. So when we thought about this plan, we realized very quickly and early on that these pieces, they just don't fit. The new source code doesn't know how to load the old data. But again, we all love World of Warcraft. We all love those memories, and we all long to go back to it. So we gave ourselves a little bit more time and thought, is there really no way to kind of force this together? What would that even look like? We gave ourselves a little bit of research and development time, and we thought, well, let's just work on transforming this data, see if there's a way that they can meet in the middle. What does that experience look like? Should be a video clip of that. So here we have a very early prototype. This was effectively a 735 client and server with its database data stripped out and imported from the 112 version of our data. We had a lot of systems that we liked. You could still cast your fireballs, you can kill creatures, the spawns from 112 were there. The drop tables had worked. A lot of the server-side elements were there, which included things like having to learn class abilities, even if you didn't have enough money to buy them at the time. True to form, you might have to leave and come back sometime later once you ground up that little extra copper. Now, of course, this was a very early prototype. We were forcing this data in, and it still obviously wasn't going to work out quite right as is. Had errors, problems, but this is an important piece of research and prototyping. Combat wasn't quite there. We found ourselves stopping to drink way too often. But really, the core of the game was there. You still leveled up. You still bought your spells. You still turned in your quests, and you still leveled up. The core pieces of the World of Warcraft nugget was there, but it was running on our modern infrastructure. This was what really gave us the proof that this was a way forward, that this could actually work. This insane idea would lead us to World of Warcraft Classic. And now, to talk a little bit more about the challenges of going from proof of concept prototype to full-blown production, it's my honor to introduce lead engineer Brian Birmingham.
Hello, BlizzCon. My name is Brian Birmingham, and I'm the lead software engineer on World of Warcraft Classic. I am a huge fan of retro gaming. I love to go back and play old games from my past, games that I played growing up, and World of Warcraft is certainly one of them. I've been playing since the beta, and it's just a great game that captured my heart even back then. But When I heard that World of Warcraft team was going to make WoW Classic, I jumped at the opportunity to come back and lead this team. But it's not my first time being on the World of Warcraft team. I first joined Blizzard in 2006, and I was on the World of Warcraft tools team. And at that time, I joined to help ship Naxxramas and to improve the way that we make World of Warcraft. I spent the next 8 years doing that. And then some of the other things I did were take the database data as it evolved over those years and convert it to each of our new expansions. And so in some ways, this project is like replaying all that work again in fast forward. I want to talk about these building blocks that Omar mentioned. These building blocks come together to create some of the things that you recognize as players. Things like terrain, the gameplay systems, the animations, and the lighting. And the first one of these that I want to talk about is terrain. Terrain is the heights of the mountains and the valleys. It's the placement of the trees and the buildings throughout the world. It's the water that's in the lakes, the rivers, the streams, the oceans. And there's a reason why in the prototype that you saw from Omar, we were in Dunmoreau. And it's because that terrain was unaltered by the Cataclysm. So it weren't perfect for that first prototype. But if we were to venture just a little bit outside of Dunmoreau and into Loch Modan, you start to see some kind of funny things. Like these Threshodons that are supposed to be swimming, but they're walking around on land, and they seem to have built these little Murloc huts for themselves, and that's not right. There's also this purple cape on the gnome, and that's odd. That's not like an epic. That's missing texture purple, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later. For now, let's focus on the fact that the water is missing and that those are the wrong buildings. If we go to other places, like, say, Thousand Needles, we'll find water that shouldn't be there. And there's Kolkar camping underneath the water and building fires. So this is also not okay. So we said, okay, just like we did with the data, what if we take these terrain files, these old terrain files we found on that backup of a backup, and we fed them to World of Warcraft Classic, to our modern engine? Would this work? No. This doesn't work either. And the reason is those puzzle shapes that Omar mentioned. Things don't fit together. Imagine this is the shape of the 112 terrain data, and our 112 engine expects that shape. So if we feed it the 112 terrain data, it fits perfectly. Our reference client that we built understands exactly where to find all of these pieces. Our modern engine expects the same pieces, but in slightly different places. And so when we feed it and of course our modern terrain data fits perfectly. If we feed it the 112 data, it doesn't fit perfectly. It finds some things where it wants to find them, like the terrain heights and the water and the grass, but it doesn't find the object placements from 112. It finds the new ones instead. So to give you an example of what that looks like, I have another video, again of Loch Modan here. So here you can see some of the buildings look okay. But as we start to fly out over the lake, which now has the water back, you can see some trees that aren't supposed to be there. Those are object placements. Those are burned trees from the Cataclysm. And then a tree flying in the middle of the air, and that's clearly not right. There's some misplaced buildings from Grim Batol. And if we turn back toward the dam, you can see the dam is shattered. And yet somehow, even though the dam is shattered, it's able to hold back the water. So here we said, there's clearly more work to do here. And our modern tools come to the rescue. It turns out that we have modern tools that we've been developing over the last 14 years that know how to read our old terrain data. They also know how to produce our modern terrain data. And so then we can take that terrain data after it's been converted and give it to the modern engine. And then the modern engine finds everything that it expects to find exactly where it expects to find it. And now the dam is restored. Our tools are really important to this. So we spent some effort on these. We wanted to make sure that our tools could work not only on Battle for Azeroth, but also on WoW Classic at the same time. This was some effort, but we thought it was really worth it because World of Warcraft Classic is not a small side project. This is a fully integrated effort that has the full support of the World of Warcraft development team. I want to talk to you about some other art assets. We've talked about models, and they're not just the character models or the creature models, but also those trees, those huts, the buildings, the lampposts. Why is that lamppost purple? Is that lamppost supposed to be purple? We have the reference client. Let's check. No, it's not supposed to be purple. It's supposed to be white. So why the difference? That's the same model. Why doesn't it look the same? And the reason it doesn't look the same is that we've made a change in the way our engine handles errors. In this case, in 1.12, we displayed, when there was a missing thing, a white light. So in the case of the gnome's cape, you remember it was purple. And in the case of this light, this lamppost, it's purple as well. And it's because something's missing. We set up this model, and we told it that it should emit a light, but we didn't say what color it was supposed to be. And our engine in 1.12 said, when I don't know what the color is supposed to be, I display white. And then we don't notice that there's a bug. We never noticed. So in our modern engine, we say, you know what? Let's display purple. Then we will notice. If I see purple, I know I have to do something. I should investigate at least and find out what the problem is. And in this case, we don't want to do what we would do in our modern version of the game. In Battle for Azeroth, if we saw this, we would have an artist come and pick an appropriate color, maybe like a soft yellow, maybe an orange, whatever they wanted for the correct aesthetic. But for us, we have a different goal. We want to recreate it as it was, authentic as it was. So we put it back exactly bright, pure white. And so if you guys check this out in the demo, either on the show floor here or at home, and you go and take a look at this lamppost, you will see that it is white today. But that one's purple. It turns out there are more than one Westfall lamppost model. They look really similar. They even have the same bug. There's 2 of them. We'll fix this one too, don't worry. We're not done yet. There are other things that weren't able to be solved by just restoring old data. It got us a long way, but there are some things where even when we restore the old data, there is no system that understands it. A great example of that is provided by the Hunter and his class abilities. The Hunter had things that aren't represented in our current engine anymore. Things like pet training, or pet happiness, or pet loyalty, and we needed to bring those back too. We had the data for them, but we needed code that would read that data. So we went back to that original source code, and we were able to surgically remove pieces of it that would support that data and bring them forward into our modern game. So we have been able to restore these systems. I don't have a lot of funny stories about this, except for some people forgetting that they needed to buy ammo. Or some hunters whose pets ran away when they forgot to feed them. We brought all this back. It's not just hunters, of course. There was also rogues and their combo points being on the target. Our modern resource and combo point system doesn't understand anything about changing targets. We had to bring that code back. And there's also things like the combat formulas to make sure that your critical hits and your crushing blows are distinct and are affected by the defense skill of the defender and the weapon skill of the attacker. And we brought back weapon skills as well. We brought back the code that levels up as you use them more, and the combat formulas that make them affect your chance to get a glancing blow. There were also animations. There's a pretty obvious bug here on this screen. That plane strider is dead, but he's standing up. I'm looting him. How am I doing that? I can even skin him. Animations are stored across all 3 of those basic building blocks: the source code, the art assets, the data, and they all contribute different things. So restoring those, we had some problems. And it affected one of the most iconic quests that I'm sure a number of you have remembered and gone back to re-experience. I'm sure you guys all remember Man Crick's wife. So we, of course, named her Olgra in the expansion. I'm sure some of you remember that. In Cataclysm, we made a memorial to her and declared that her name was Olgra. But of course, in 1.12, she was only known to you as Beaten Corpse, because you were supposed to discover her and find her dead, and she's standing up, like the plane strider. It seems a little bit odd to be interacting and inspecting a dead body that's standing up in front of you. Well, maybe not for the Horde. In any case, we were able to find these bugs, we were able to track them down, we were able to restore it, and now all of our animations are playing correctly. You can go and get revenge on the Quillbore for what they did to poor Mancrick and Olgra, and you will see them lying dead when they are dead. I also want to talk about some of our classic UI screens, like the character customization screen. This is something you see very early in the game that's really near and dear to our hearts. It has great feelings of nostalgia for all of us, and I'm sure for you too. And when we look at the prototype, we had the correct race and class combinations. We got that from the data, but the art is wrong. And so we went and restored that art. And here we ran into another case where restoring the art was not enough. When we look at these two screens, they're a lot closer now, but the reference client seems to have almost a snowy effect, whereas the prototype here, or our work in progress rather, does not. And we went and looked into this. It's not weather, it's not snow, it's actually a fog effect. And we were able to find the engine equations that controlled that and restore them a little bit closer. I don't want to promise pixel perfect perfection, because we might not hit it. But we are doing these side-by-side comparisons all the time, and we're going to work as hard as we can to get this as close as possible. On that same subject, I want to talk about Elwyn Forest. Here's an example where we went through at one point in WoW's history and we changed all of the lighting equations, and our environment artists went back and plugged in new data values to control those new equations and make things look correct for that version of the game. And so when we wanted to rewind those changes, the first thing we did was put back the old data, and we got close, but there's still some problems, like this really bright light over here. This doesn't look right. You can also see the shadows are slightly different, the fog is slightly different, but focus on this light for now. That light has a really hard edge. It's really way too bright. And when we dug into this, we found that what was controlling this was the distance fall-off equation. This is an equation that controls how much light is projected onto a texture based on how far away the light is from the thing that it is lighting. And so when we saw that this was different, we dug into it, we found the formula, and we were able to make adjustments in the code to make this look much closer. We fixed the shadows and the fogs a little bit too. So now we're much closer. I imagine at this point, you guys are wondering one of two things. Are you done yet? Or are you sure that it wouldn't have been easier to take that reference client and fix that? And I want to answer that second question first. A common theme in all of the problems and the bugs that we've encountered across this presentation so far is that they are visible. You can't fix what you can't see. So when we see these things, when we look at the modern version of World of Warcraft today, if I go to Battle for Azeroth and I take a look at it, I can see what is different between that and Classic. Like this trainer screen. It works, but it doesn't look right. We fixed it. We can find these things and we can fix them. We can do this over and over again. We can get your help finding them so that we can get this right. If we had started with the reference client, all of those problems are invisible problems. We know they're there, but we don't know about each individual one. They're the kinds of problems you can't see until a malicious actor is abusing them and destroying things for your players. Or when the servers are crashing only because there are millions of players online at once, and you couldn't get that in testing. So this is an approach that we took to make sure that we could ensure that same Blizzard level of quality that you've all come to expect. As for whether or not we're done, we're not. We clearly have a lot more work to do. Besides things that I've mentioned in this presentation so far, there's capital cities, dungeons and raids, boss abilities. All of our PvP systems are still waiting for us to go take a look at them. And so we have a lot more work to go. And to talk about some of our design philosophies and how those affect the decisions that are coming up ahead, I want to bring back to the stage Game Director Ian Hazzakostas.
Thank you, Brian. So working on WoW Classic, basically it's like almost in a consulting capacity. It's been a really fascinating experience as a designer. Because normally, what I do most of the day with Battle for Azeroth is creative work, it's problem solving, it's identifying a hole, figuring out the right puzzle piece that's going to fit that hole perfectly, thinking about things that might cause, and so on and so forth. But in the case of WoW Classic, that work was already done. That work was completed 12 years ago. And so that raises the question of, like, what does design even mean when it comes to this project? Well, as Brian laid out, there are a number of differences, right? There's a countless list of differences between the prototype, the work in progress that we have running, and the original 1.12 client and server structure. It's differences in UI, in code, in systems, in player-facing interface elements, and so forth. And every single one of those represents a decision. Do we maintain the status quo? Do we do work to remove something that was added, to reintroduce something? Or in some cases, do we even re-add certain bugs that were fixed along the way but felt like parts of the experience. And so before we began any of these decisions, we wanted to come up with a framework that would help guide us. And first and foremost, really, is authenticity as our goal. We want to create an experience that feels just like 2006 World of Warcraft. If someone was playing WoW in 2006 and they lay down and took a very, very, very long nap and woke up in 2019 and we sat them in front of WoW Classic, it shouldn't feel like an immediately different experience. You might wonder, like, why is this monitor so thin and all of that? But other than that, it should feel like the game that you know. Second, when it comes to authenticity, that's not just about things like weapon skill and crit and crushing blows and all that. It's also about the community. It's about the social dynamics that are part of what defined WoW Classic. We understand that that is a key part of the experience, and anything that might threaten to undermine those dynamics is something that we need to be very suspect about, and again, use authenticity as our guide. Even if it might seem minor at a glance, those small changes could have large ripple effects that would change the way players related to the world and to each other. Finally, we really had this 112 data that we'd been able to restore, and we viewed that as almost sacrosanct. That's everything from the world and the quest lines and the stories to individual player abilities, creature health, tuning, and so forth. There's some changes in code and architecture in the way the client responds to the server and vice versa, that if we let stand using the modern structure, might have caused this data to produce a different result when it comes to things like game balance. And we definitely worried that if we ever felt like the result was different in a way that compelled us to crack this open, it would very much be like opening Pandora's box. Because the second we start to substitute our modern judgment to solve problems from 12 years ago, we are deviating from our goal of a historical recreation of the game as it was and making something different. And that's something we want to avoid. So let me give you some examples of these problems as we dealt with them. A lot of these were really clear-cut. At the start of the project, we came up with a laundry list of literally dozens and dozens, over 100 items of ways in which the initial prototype that we had differed from the original experience. Some of these were just 5-minute, even 30-second conversations. Dungeon Finder. Of course we're not going to have Dungeon Finder or Group Finder in WoW Classic. I mean, that really speaks to the core social dynamic. Yes, it was inconvenient to stand in town spamming trade chat looking for a healer for 30 minutes. And yes, that meant that if you only had, some time before you headed to work in the morning, you couldn't realistically run a dungeon. And there are definitely advantages to being able to just instantly matchmake and teleport to the dungeon. But it also meant that when you found that healer, maybe you'd add them to your friends list. Maybe you'd have someone that you could rely on because it was super important to have friends, to have allies that you could join with, to not have to rely on spamming trade chat for 40 minutes. Or maybe when someone made a mistake and accidentally aggroed an extra mob and wiped the group, you probably weren't going to kick them out of the group for that mistake because it would have meant going back to town and spamming trade chat for 30 more minutes. So no Dungeon Finder. And yes, I know if you type /LFR in the current demo client, a window will pop up. That's not functional. It's a vestige. That's being removed. I think that's part of what Brian just alluded to. There's a lot of work still left to do, just because there is an element that you see in the experience that's playable on the floor or at home right now. Please don't take that to mean that that represents a final determination of what the game is going to look like. This is what I'm trying to lay out right now. Cross-realm grouping, again, no way, right? Realm identity, reputation, seeing the same people over and over again, knowing who the best geared warrior on your server is, those are important elements of the classic experience. That needs to be maintained. Flying, I'm not even going to dignify that. Let's skip ahead. Achievements. No. Again, achievements weren't even introduced until Wrath of the Lich King. So even if the infrastructure were there to support them code-wise, the data wouldn't be there. But again, this was a seemingly innocuous system, but it layered on an additional set of motivations to a world that didn't necessarily need them in its original form, that had its own goals to pursue. I mean, completionists were definitely a thing back in Classic. It's just you didn't get 10 achievement points for it. You just had the warm, fuzzy feelings and the satisfaction of 999 out of 1,000 exalted down the line and full green bars. And that was really what mattered back then. And another example, unified auction houses. Over the years, Alliance and Horde now share a single auction house no matter where you go. Not in Classic. In Classic, if you want to trade with the Alliance and you're a Horde player, well, head up to Everlook, Booty Bay, Ratchet, Gadget Zen, pay the increased Goblin auction house cut, and maybe you can get your hands on some pet or something that's not readily available to your own faction. But that's part of the feeling of the world as a whole. Again, these were easy decisions. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, there are a number of decisions that we debated about a lot that were much trickier and that in some cases we're still talking about to this day. So first off, the debuff limit. In original World of Warcraft, when the game launched in 2004, you could have 8 debuffs on a mob, and that was it. And then things would start to get pushed off. I feel bad for you if you're a warrior trying to use deep wounds and trying to convince your raid leader that it was the best talent to do good damage. I feel really bad for you if you were a rogue wielding a barman shanker. But those were, that was not something that was compatible with keeping key things like Sunder armor on bosses that you were fighting in dungeons, let alone raids. We raised that debuff limit to 16 in 2005, but that's where it stood all the way until Burning Crusade when it went up to 40, and today it's like 255, effectively uncapped. Well, so what do we do here? Honestly, this was a technical limitation. I don't think this was an example of design values differing. This was just a question of how much memory was being used for each unit in the world and what could the servers handle at the time. It's honestly frankly not great game design to have a game where you have 40-player raids, where each member of that raid might apply up to a couple of different debuffs, and they're all fighting the same enemy, and you can only have a total of 16 of them at once with no real control over what gets pushed off. Not great. That said, we are restoring the 16 debuff limit. Now, why are we doing that, you might ask, if it's frankly objectively worse design? That actually implicates the third point on my original philosophy slide, which is we don't want to mess with the 112 data. We don't want to mess with balance. If we change the code in this regard, who's to say what effects that would have on balance in raids and PvP and elsewhere? Maybe suddenly dot classes like Warlocks and others are far more effective than they had been. And we have actually a different outcome, a different metagame than the original Classic experience produced. And that would actually be deviating from authenticity. So this was an area where, even though we feel it's worse and we can articulate arguments for why even the team of 2006 would have raised the limit if they could have technically, we're not going to because it would be inaccurate. Now, shifting from combat to something that seems maybe more innocuous, mail. So back in the day, if you wanted to send mail to Nault, to a guildmate, it would actually take 1 hour for it to arrive. If you wanted to send materials to someone to craft an item for you, it would take an hour before they could get them. They could craft the item, mail it back to you. That would take another hour round trip. In fact, that made it so that you might actually want to, if you're in Orgrimmar and your guildmates in Booty Bay, go to the Zeppelin Tower, get on the Zeppelin, head out there, hand the items to them directly because it would be faster. Small, subtle thing, but it's something that actually helped reinforce the feeling of a world and navigating the world. And so that's something that we are restoring. We are removing instant mail, and it's going to go back to how it was. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, something that's not necessarily going to be the same. So user interface-wise, back then, it was not as easy to manipulate the user interface in terms of attaching items, or today you can shift right-click to just directly take something out and put it in your bags. Honestly, it doesn't make sense to do work to remove pure UI conveniences that have no impact on gameplay, no impact on social mechanics, and the sorts of things that an add-on could easily reproduce. So yes, there'll be slight differences in that you can take mail out of your mailbox a bit faster. We think that's OK. Apologies if anyone disagrees. Another example, loot trading. So this was a system added in Wrath of the Lich King, where if you've looted an item from a dungeon or raid boss, there's a 2-hour window where you can give it to someone else, even though it's bind on pickup, who also participated in the boss kill. Now, this was added to solve a common problem that existed back in Classic, where if you accidentally looted an item, someone else in the raid was meant to get it, or maybe it was master looted to the wrong person, you could open a customer support ticket, contact the GM, and say, I didn't mean to loot this, I would like to give it to so-and-so. And it might actually take a 4 or 5 day turnaround time, but CS would generally help you out with that problem and transfer the item. This is a case where we're keeping loot trading in because the end result is the same. We're just saving you a 4 or 5 day wait, or thankfully a shorter wait these days given our support turnaround, but we're also freeing customer support bandwidth to focus on other player issues. The actual result is not the same. And apologies if you were planning on using the ninja looting excuse of like, I totally didn't mean to click it. I guess I just have to equip it now. Other small stuff. If you played a rogue back then, you might remember energy regeneration worked differently than it did today. Today, there's predictive regeneration on the client where you get 1 point of energy every 1/10 of a second or so modified by haste. Back then, and this was a limitation of infrastructure, client-server communication, it came back in much larger discrete chunks. That meant you could be sitting at 38 energy wanting to use a 40 energy Sinister Strike, and you might have to wait over a second to do so. Again, not the product of an active design desire, but just a technical limitation that no longer exists today. But because this impacts things like the pacing and flow and feel of playing a rogue, or some PvP implications for pooling for burst, we are restoring the old energy regeneration. Now, finally, probably the thorniest area here, add-ons. This is one that we're still actually figuring out, and that we welcome discussion with the community and add-on authors regarding. Way back in 2005, 2006, add-ons could do some things that they can't do today. Some very powerful things, like making intelligent decisions regarding spell casting, spell selection, targeting, canceling your casts if they weren't going to be effective. And those functionality was removed in Burning Crusade. Now, using modern author knowledge and the overall sophistication of the community, combined with that old tool set, you could pretty much write add-ons or macros that could automate playing your class, where you just push the same button over and over again, and it does your rotation perfectly, it picks the right targets, and so forth. That's something that we feel is antithetical to the spirit of World of Warcraft, whether it was in 2005 or today. And so those functions will not be available in the modern UI. On the other end of the spectrum, though, there's stuff that's been added to the UI API since then that allows for the creation of add-ons that communicate with each other and can be used to create social networks within the game. We're actually kind of suspicious of these and skeptical about the possibility of add-ons reproducing some of the functionality that we've deliberately removed from Classic that we feel could be harmful to the authentic experience. And we know that once it's out there, saying just don't use it if you don't want it isn't good enough, because it will start to become part of the fabric. And so we may be restricting some of those new things as well. We're likely going to find some kind of middle ground that combines the old and the new here, with a goal towards making sure that the vast majority of the add-ons that people know and expect function with the goal of an authentic experience. Now, just to wrap up, there's one big thing that we haven't talked about yet. I know I've heard a lot of questions about this. So what are we doing with content? Right? In 1.12, everything was available. All the way through Naxxramas, all that stuff was unlocked. There were catch-up mechanisms and reputations and things that were not there originally. What do we do? So we understand that World of Warcraft, especially back then, was about a journey. And the catch-up mechanisms that might undermine or compete with gear from Molten Core or Onyxia and make that stuff irrelevant would really shape, and not for the better, the experience of progressing through that content. And so we are going to have staged content unlocks throughout the release of Classic. So we will begin with the game more or less as it stood in the spring of 2005, which for many European players is actually the game that they first emerged into, because WoW came out a bit later there then. And that will be Molten Core and Onyxia as the pinnacle of the available raid content, Dire Maul existing, and the world bosses like Khazak and Azurgos. Notably, what will not be present, other than later raid content, is also the formal PvP reward system, including items from Battlegrounds and the High Warlord Grand Marshal grinds, because those actually overshadow a lot of the early raid gear. It's a big deal if you can just go into Alterac Valley and get an unstoppable force that favorably compares to the majority of weapons from the raid. There's something wrong about that. Now, when folks are ready for it, and this is something that we'll determine as the game evolves naturally and organically, we'll have a second wave of content that includes Whoops, skipped ahead a little bit, but whatever. Blackwing Lair, Battlegrounds, PvP rewards, and the 20-player raid of Zul'Gurub. After that, when folks are ready, Encourage 20 and 40, the Outdoor Silithus content, the so-called Tier 0.5 quest lines, and the Green Dragons. And yes, Silithus content means the opening of the gates of Encourage. And as we see the race to become the new round of Scarab Lords unfold. And then finally, Naxxramas and the accompanying content. Again, exact timing of this to be discussed further, and I'm sure there's stuff that we're not accounting for that we've forgotten. Look forward to a dialogue with the community in the coming months to figure out exactly which bucket things should fall into and how this will all work out. So there we have it. That's where we stand today. Thank you so much for joining us for this look back and this look ahead to what remains between now and next summer. We can't wait to get back to the office after BlizzCon, listen to feedback from everyone playing the demo, and do everything in our power to get this wrapped up and into your hands as soon as possible. And we can't wait to join you in pre-Cataclysm Azeroth next summer. Thank you.